we're still such a young discipline, truthfully. And my hope would be one day coaching is globally an academic discipline.
Welcome to Coaching Revealed, the podcast brought to you by the Institute of Coaching. In this episode of Coaching Revealed, we're kicking off a new series on coaching research and the evidence base of the profession. Opening this new season is Angela Passarelli, former Director of Research and current Chair of the IOC's Scientific Advisory Council. Angela is interviewed in this episode by IOC Executive Director Jeff Hull about the history of coaching research. As a researcher, Angela studied at the Weatherhead School of Management at Case Western Reserve University with David Kolb and Richard Boyatzis. Noticing the sparseness of coaching literature available at the time, Angela was inspired to contribute to the field, with her early work focusing on fMRI studies, neurobiology, and the human reaction to various forms of leadership styles. Within the coaching field of study, Angela shares her excitement on the improvement in the methodology of coaching research, with papers and projects shifting their focus from just validating efficacy to also showcasing meta-analysis. Additionally, research on the profession's impact has increased in scope to include the fields of leadership, healthcare, and education. This includes the work of the Institute of Coaching to provide opportunities for researchers as we disseminate knowledge to active practitioners in the field. To close out the episode, Angela shares how individuals can support research by joining organizations like the Institute of Coaching and investing time into learning from the research and contributing to the work of research institutions. If you are interested in learning about research or submitting proposals for coaching research grants, please go to theinstituteofcoaching.org to learn more. Thank you for tuning into Coaching Revealed. Let's get started.
Well, hello, everyone, and welcome to Coaching Revealed, the podcast from the Institute of Coaching. My name is Jeffrey Hull. I'm the Executive Director of the Institute of Coaching, and I'm super excited to be kicking off a new series of podcasts over the next few months where we will focus on the coaching and research space, how it has evolved, what the latest findings are that our grant recipients and others that are doing great research around the world are involved in, and talk to some of the actual researchers that are having a strong impact on the field as we build the evidence base for coaching as a modality that has taken the world by storm. It's one of the fastest growing professions, and the Institute of Coaching, with over 5,000 members, is really committed to being the organization that brings research to the practice. And so I'm super excited to kick off this series. And we have someone very special with us today to help me do that. Her name is Dr. Angela Passarelli, and she is near and dear to the Institute of Coaching. She is the former research director for the Institute and someone that I've known for many years, and also someone who was a recipient of a grant from the Institute of Coaching back a few years ago, and we'll talk about that. So we thought it would be really special to kick off this series with someone who has done research, continues to do research. She is considered an expert in the field of research and coaching, and has also worked as part of the leadership team at the Institute of Coaching. So hi, Angela. It's great to have you here.
Hi, Jeff. It's such an honor to be with you.
Well, this is fun. We're having like this formal conversation with someone that we used to work together every day. So it's really a joy to have you here. And for those that are listening to this podcast and may not know a lot about Dr. Passarelli, let me just take a quick second. I'm not going to read through her entire CV because that would take up the entire 45-minute podcast. A few things that you should know about Angela. She is an associate professor of the practice of management at Duke University's Fuqua School of Business, and she serves as the academic director for the school's co-curricular academic mission related to leadership development, teamwork, and team development. She is really an expert in research in the dynamics of intentional change theory, and we'll talk about that, and the process of experiential learning. She has done a whole series of different research activities at Case Western Reserve University And as I mentioned, she has been the director of research for us over a multi-year period. So she really knows the space. And that's one of the reasons why we wanted to kick off our series with Angela, because she not only is a researcher herself, but she has worked with our scientific advisory board, which is making the decisions about how we fund research. And it's a complex process because, as those of you that are potentially interested in research or know a little bit about it, there's a lot of people that would love to be involved in research, but it's a little more complex than just deciding you're going to do a study or send out a survey and so we take the study of coaching and the science that underpins coaching very seriously. And Angela has really been core to the team at the Institute over many years in building the relationships we have with an advisory council, with our grantees, with the funding. We have had this wonderful collaboration with the International Coach Federation, ICF, and Angela has been a big part of that. So I'm super excited to have you here. I think probably what I'd love to do, Angela, is start by going into your background a little, because you can go back wherever you feel called to, but I think people would love to hear how you got started in this space and how you see your journey having evolved.
Sure. So it's a dangerous invitation to say, go back as far as you want to, because there are deep, deep roots for me. So I will not give you the whole story, but I would be remiss if I didn't mention I had this amazing teacher in eighth grade, or actually all the way back to seventh grade, student council, who seeded an intellectual interest for me in leadership and leadership development and leadership dynamics in groups. And my interest today has not evolved far from where it began when I was an early teenager, honestly. And so I have to say, shout out to Mr. Stephen Sproles, who was my sort of guide for many years through student council activities, even in junior and senior high school. So that's where it all started. But I'll fast forward past that many, many years to when I went back to start my doctoral studies in the field of organizational behavior. I found Case Western Reserve University because Dr. David Kolb, who is sort of the father of experiential learning theory that I used in my work and in my master's studies prior to that, he was there, as well as Dr. Richard Boyatzis, who later became my thesis advisor and has been a lifelong mentor and collaborator of mine. I met him while I interviewed there, and it became clear to me that that was the doctoral program that I belonged in, and so was very fortunate to be invited to attend that program, their doctoral program in organizational behavior. And I went there during a really interesting time. Let's see, I would have started in 2007. So just at the beginning of not quite the financial crisis, but it was about to occur, the 2009 financial crisis. Things were still being seeded. And my class of 5 doctoral students was the only class in the entire Weatherhead School of Management at the time to be admitted. So the doctoral programs there had been closed for 2 years. So there were still some senior doctoral students finishing their dissertations, but no one was in coursework. It was just the 5 of us. And that also meant that there were tons of opportunities for research because there weren't people ahead of us filling those positions. And there were 2 pivotal things that happened for me that brought me to coaching. One was I worked on a paper on women's leadership development with Diana Villamoria and some other colleagues. And we looked at all the various methods of leadership development. And the 2 that I was focused on in the paper were mentoring and coaching. And I realized at that time that there was very little literature, scientific literature on coaching. And so that's a gold mine for a young doctoral student because it says, oh, here's a field that is ripe for study. So that, and we were doing a lot of coaching, both in executive education and in the degree programs at Case Western Reserve University at the time. So I not only began to practice coaching, I was certified and began practicing coaching, but Richard Boyatzis, who had done a lot of work on emotional intelligence, was really less focused on what emotional intelligence was and why that was important to effective leadership. He was more focused on how do we help people build emotional and social competence. And so one fundamental way we did that, both in practice and in research, was through one-on-one executive coaching. That I just sort of fast-tracked into that. I had a background in higher ed administration with a focus in adult development. So I'd had a lot of counseling courses, adult development theory courses. And so coaching was just sort of a natural fit for both my skill set and my sort of scholarly interests. And so that's where the seeds were planted.
That's amazing. I mean, I remember you and I probably first met in 2012, so it goes back a ways. You were doing a presentation on your research, which involved, and you're going to have to remind me what the core of the research was, but I do remember that it was looking at fMRI studies of the brain around and the connectivity around neuroscience and emotional intelligence. That was really new for me. So I was like, wow, this is so cool. And now, of course, I think it's become, especially with Richard Boyatzis and his work, it's become sort of relatively well known that there are really powerful studies of the way the brain reacts to emotional triggers and the amygdala and how it shows up, it lights up the brain and stuff like that. So, but I've never actually asked you this question, which is, how did you form the research question that led you to those studies back in the day?
Back in the day, I would say it was initially Richard's questions that he was asking. Richard has an unbelievable mind for divergent information. I mean, he can see patterns from so many different sources and bodies of knowledge and integrate them to ask questions about what he's interested in. He was very interested in the mind and what we were learning at the time about the brain. And I'm not sure if this, I think at the time there was a presidential, in the US, like a presidential initiative to map the brain. And we were still at the point of trying to understand what different areas in the brain, what functions they served. And so there was just a lot of interest and there's also a limit on what we can self-report or behaviorally observe. And so being able to measure our neurobiology, either through neuroimaging or through other aspects of psychophysiology, gives researchers new insight into human behavior that we are just unable to report. And so our first study was actually looking at people's recollections of their interactions with resonant and dissonant leaders. And we published that study in the Leadership Quarterly. And then we were interested in an aspect of intentional change theory, which I call a sub-theory. It has to do with emotional attractors and how our thinking, our behavior, our perceptions organize around our psychophysiological state. And a piece of that is how we feel emotionally. The other piece of it is how those emotions impact our autonomic nervous system and our ability to regulate. And these are things that are very difficult for people to self-report on, especially in the moment. And so the early studies probably that you saw us present were trying to understand, what was happening in the client's neurobiology when they interacted with different types of styles of coaches or styles of coaching. And so that's some of the work that we were presenting there. And I can go into more detail if you want, but if that's not what the objective here is, we can.
Yeah, no, it's fascinating to think that was around 2012, that there was a shift in the capabilities technologically in terms of what we could start to study, and actually, rather than just observed behavior, but actually looking at how the neuroscience actually shows up in the way people operate in the world, so to speak. And you were then involved in a Harnish grant from the Institute, right?
Ready to advance your coaching practice? Join the Institute of Coaching and tap into the world's leading resource for coaching science and professional development. With over 4,000 members across 130 countries, the IOC offers invaluable networking opportunities with an elite global coaching community and innovative learning to broaden your knowledge and keep you at the forefront of coaching best practices. Engage in cutting-edge learning events with world-renowned coaching scholars, from webinars and seminars to discussion groups, research projects, and more. Try any membership free for 30 days. Use promo code IOC Podcast and visit instituteofcoaching.org/join to get started.
Right. So relatedly, the Harnish grant was a little bit different. So one of the things, as I was working as a research assistant on some of those studies, and I was doing the grunt labor and realized that we were not able to fully simulate coaching interactions in the scanner. The paradigm that we use to do the neuroimaging research is they would have interactions with two different coaches and kind of two different styles, and then they would go into the brain scanner and they would see videos of the coaches who they met with asking different statements that they had to agree or disagree with. And we thought at the time we could simulate this as being kind of like a WebEx interaction. And we even went so far as to have a coach show up there when the participant went into the scanner, but everybody knew it wasn't real. And so I was interested in my dissertation work to, number one, do some studies that were more ecologically valid, where we could take some of the psychophysiological measures in real time while people were in coaching conversations. And I was specifically interested in autonomic regulation. So simply stated, I was interested in stress response during the coaching interactions. And so I needed equipment that we didn't have available to us at Weatherhead to measure galvanic skin response and heart rate variability in real time in coaching interactions. And so at a high level aware of the IOC, but had never been to a conference. And honestly, the IOC was very new at the time. And so I just Googled coaching research grant, having no idea that there was such a thing. And the Harnish grant popped up and my eyes lit up and I emailed Richard, like, look at this could be it. And one thing led to another. And that's eventually the IOC funded that research.
And can you summarize one of the outcomes of that? Or do you remember?
Sure. One of the things that a part of intentional change theory is that when people have conversations about their ideal self, who they really wish to be, their passion, purpose, and values, that this creates a parasympathetic response. It's the rest and digest response. It puts people at ease. It's kind of an antidote to stress. And then when we're talking about problems and issues, particularly that are externally driven, that make us feel like, oh, I'm obligated to do this. I don't really want to do this. It's what I ought to do, but not necessarily aligned with who I want to be, that is more creates a stress response in the sympathetic system. So I was able to look at this in real time. And what we found was actually in real time, having a conversation, the first conversation about my personal vision for the future, my ideal self, was actually equally as stressful as having a conversation about what I should be doing to achieve my goals that perhaps I'm not doing today. And we were really surprised by that. But what we found later is once the coach left the room, the participant, the client, was working on a individualized goal setting exercise. What we saw was a psychophysiologically adaptive response after that visioning conversation that did not happen after the more goal-oriented problem-solving conversation. And that was also reflected in their behavioral measures. Like, for example, one of the ways we sort of triangulated it was we saw this adaptive response in the physiology. And then we thought, how do we know that was going on? So we went back to the actual goal statements, which were fascinating in and of themselves, the differences between the two. But we saw that people spent the same amount of time on that goal exercise after each conversation, but they made more grammatical and spelling errors in the conversation in the goal setting exercise that followed the conversation about problems and goal setting.
Wow. Okay. Because they were stressed in a different way?
Yes, exactly. Because it was maladaptive stress. And so I think it really, to us, it added nuance to how you work with a client through a coaching conversation, how you can prepare them psychophysiologically to be more able to do the work of coaching
and actually get the benefits of it. really, right?
Exactly. So, and at the time, the coaching industry, and to some degree, I think this is still true, drills down on problems immediately. You know, like, where are your shortcomings, and how do we shore those up? You know, here's 360 feedback. Here are the problems that you're facing that are preventing you from being the best version of yourself you can be, and we start there. And it's not connected to who that individual really wants to be. And it's a small, you know, it's a very subtle shift in the conversation from starting with the ideal and values and how do I connect this to something greater than I am today, to a long-term sort of affirmative image, rather when it starts with this sort of short-term threat driven how do I survive kind of state. It really doesn't optimize the individual to be open to new ideas, to be creative, to be accurate. And so these are some of the things that we were able to see with the physiological measures that the Harnish grant supported, that we would not have been able to see if we were just looking at that coaching interaction.
Yeah, I mean, I do remember that was probably one of the early days for me at the Institute of Coaching too. I wasn't working there. I was just attending or volunteering. And I remember you're sharing some of these results. And yeah, it's interesting because it's on the one level, it's very subtle and nuanced. It's not this huge breakthrough, but on another level, it is huge because you realize the impact you're having as a coach is potentially putting people in a more stressful sort of, I think Richard would say, a compliant kind of mode.
Yes.
As opposed to a big picture visionary possibility kind of mode. And like you said back then, and it's still true today, just to a certain extent, you know, coach training is all about, so how do you ask the right question and ask the open-ended question and look for what does that person want to fix and what's broken. And yeah, you were early on into something that was much more powerful, really, in terms of like expansion of what's possible for people.
Right. Yes, exactly. I would say that's exactly true. And I want to come back to the word expansion in just a minute, and also double click on the idea that how to ask the right question at the right time. So if you fast forward more than a decade, one of the failings, or not failings, but one of the ways that the research has evolved is that now I don't look at those two states that are associated with intentional change theory, the positive and negative emotional attractor state. I don't look at them as being universally good or bad. There are times in a coaching process, and even in a coaching conversation, when you need a little negative emotional attractor, a little NEA, to help someone focus, to help someone address the things that could be derailers for them. And the nuance then for coaches is learning how to sequence them, how to identify where a person is, how to not move them away in a way that doesn't validate who they are and how they feel, but that is in service of what you're trying to achieve together. And so I think today we're thinking about it, at least I'm thinking about it in terms of what's adaptive and maladaptive in the moment for the individual, and, you know, helping coaches understand, really advanced coaches understand, how do I both attend to this where that person is and where I am in the moment, and how do I respond in a way that helps the client move toward an adaptive mode, whichever direction that might be. It could be both.
And it's been quite an evolution. I mean, talk to us a little bit about the evolution, both of your research, but of your experience as you got more involved in the broader context of research. What have you noticed in terms of how the research has changed over time? Because you mentioned a decade has gone by.
Almost 15 years. I guess the grant that I received was in 2012, I believe. So yeah, it's been quite some time. And the field, I think two things have happened. You know, the field of coaching, you mentioned as we started this conversation, that it's at this point a profession. At that point, it was sort of, people in my field would say, this is a management fad. This isn't, you know, it was a practice. You know, it was not necessarily an identity or a profession that is as widely recognized as it is today. The industry has evolved rapidly, and the research has also evolved. So in 2012, I think scholars were really preoccupied with the outcome of coaching and the efficacy of coaching. I think that was largely driven by a need to provide legitimacy for the field, that this is something that works, so to speak. And those studies are still going on. They're still important. And I think research is evolving, is starting to double down on the mechanisms. So how is it effective? What makes it effective, and for whom, and at what time? So there's that. The field has also proliferated in terms of the application and I guess forms of coaching. For now, there's peer coaching and team coaching and group coaching, and so research is also trying to understand and examine those other forms of coaching, how they differ, where might they be effective and not effective, how are they differently delivered. There's that piece. I think another way that the field is responding, I think much of the research is responding to what's actually happening in the field. So another big piece of what's happening in the field right now is artificial and especially generative AI is shaping the field. And so we are getting at the Institute, getting quite a few grant applications to look at different aspects of AI and coaching. So I think that's a avenue the field is approaching. We're going to see more and more of that research in the future on coaching.
Yeah, tell me a little bit about, because you and I worked together over many years, but I didn't actually get to see the evolution of the proposals that would come in over time. And I'm curious, over the period at which you were in the role of the director of research at the Institute, did you see any particular themes? Obviously, currently we're seeing AI, but if you go back a ways, what were some of the things that you started to see? I know we did a study around burnout, which became very prevalent in the research around coaching, but that's still fairly recent, coming out of the pandemic, last couple of years. But let's say we go back to, you're saying 2012, if you go back into the 2015 to 2020 period, what were the kinds of research proposals that you were reviewing?
2015 to 2020, I was a member of the Scientific Advisory Council, so I was reviewing them. I wouldn't have seen all of the proposals that came through, but I saw the ones that went to the second stage of review. Before I get to the topic of the proposals, one thing that really sticks out to me as an evolution is the sophistication of the methodology. Research has gotten much more rigorous, much stronger, much more reliable in terms of the methods that are being used, the depth of understanding of the scholars who are using those methods. That is phenomenally improved over the years. And we're very careful about that as we review grant proposals today. And then in terms of topics, I think even then there was still very much a focus on efficacy and outcomes, because it wasn't until about 2020 that we started to see in the academic literature some, not meta-analyses, because we don't have the quantitative data for that, but sort of meta-analytic reviews that are papers that attempt to synthesize individual studies of efficacy. So we saw probably 3 papers like that come out between 2019 and 2021. And that's when the proposals really started to pivot, because we have a pretty robust body of knowledge that suggests that coaching can move the needle on things like burnout, career satisfaction, life satisfaction, well-being, some of these leadership efficacy and effectiveness. So we have quite a bit of that research having been conducted. So now what we're seeing more of is understanding dynamics and characteristics of the person who is the coach. I think that is an understudied area. So we've had some proposals around that. We've had proposals coming from areas where coaching is growing, and in particular, healthcare and education. So looking at the role of coaching in those contexts. We funded a great study on pro bono coaching, because this is a phenomenon that's happening in the industry. And our role as scholars is to try to understand it and share what we can back to practice to shape best practices.
What about the multicultural aspects of coaching? Because now it's become really a global phenomenon. And I wonder, did you see any proposals in the last few years for people looking at the distinctions between coaching in India versus coaching in Korea versus coaching? Because there is a bias that the Western approach is the right approach, right? I mean, that's even true in science. There's a Western bias in terms of scientific rigor. So I don't know. I mean, the proposals, the kind of research that we've seen. What's your sense of that?
My response is probably at two different levels. One level, we've seen some proposals come through they've been unsuccessful because they're really market research, trying to understand the landscape of coaching in various parts of the world. And so those are of great value to the industry, but they're not what we fund. So that's one aspect. Another aspect that we've seen is looking more specifically, for example, at race dynamics in coaching conversations. So there's been some great proposals, and I think Ariel Bernstein did some work to look at composition of the coach-coachee dyad and the degree to which race-based issues are brought up if there's not alignment between, if you have coaches who are from two different racial backgrounds. So there's been, and DEI in general. So I think looking at how coaching can help specific underrepresented groups we've definitely seen a number of proposals in those areas. So those are two different themes in the proposals that we've received.
Yeah, and it's fascinating. I hope that this period of time that's happening, at least in the US, is sort of denigrating the DEI conversation, is a transitional phase, and that we will, resume the evolution of the humanity that is diverse, whether we like it or not, I think at the end of the day. But we won't turn this into a political conversation. So the research for the future, because there may be folks listening that are either doing research, they may have an academic focus, or they may be coaches just interested in research. And I think, I'd love to hear what your thoughts are about, obviously AI is playing a maybe outsized role right now in the field, but what kinds of things do you think we should be looking at in terms of continuing to build out the science?
Well, I think one of the things that's really important about continuing to enhance the science is that we continue to use strong methodology to do our work. And so that, coupled with the notion that the whole objective of doing coaching research is to enhance coaching practice. So we're uniquely positioned to do really strong applied research that involves coaching practitioners at all stages of the research process. So I think really innovative research in the future will involve practicing coaches helping to curate the questions that scholars are answering and asking in their research. It involves them in both being sources of data and collecting data, but also helping to interpret that data and making recommendations for practice. So I think the field, to the extent that we can create new and innovative ways to bring science and practice together, that's a future for coaching research that is unique from other fields that may rely on more basic science. And then, I think that we're still such a young discipline, truthfully. And my hope would be one day coaching is globally an academic discipline. Right now, our scholars are housed in all sorts of different disciplines. You'll find them in all sorts of different schools. There's no conference that is only for coaching research, which might be a good thing, right? It might be good to blend research and practice. But I do hope that we do work that creates the foundation for an academic discipline one day. And in order to do that, we need to look at all the different ways that coaching is happening. And I think get beyond an interest in efficacy and coach competence, beyond that to looking at the dynamics that are happening between the coach and coachee and the mechanisms that allow coaching to work or not work in certain contexts. I think we need to look at all of the different types and forms of coaching that are happening beyond just sort of the dyadic interactions to team coaching, peer coaching, group coaching, kind of what that looks like. I have a particular interest for me to look at what are the benefits of coaching to the coach themselves. I think we often are so focused on the coachee that we forget why it's valuable for people to do this, whether they do it professionally full time or just as a component of their their leader toolkit. And of course, there's then all the external influences that are impacting how coaching happens. So everything from the technological environment to the socio-political environment to, who has access to coaching, who has access to coach training, how, all those issues of equity, I think, are ripe areas for future research in the coaching space.
Yeah, absolutely. And so do you find yourself currently, I know you have a relatively new role as a professor at Duke in the business school. Do you have time to do research anymore? Where do you focus your energy?
Yeah, so while I am doing a little bit of research, I'm at a point in my career where a lot of my time goes to helping other researchers in terms of chairing the scientific advisory council, making sure that when we get promising applications, whether they're funded or not, we enhance the work by providing really high quality developmental feedback. So I spend a lot of my time contributing to scholarship and research that way. I've always been particularly interested in coaching for underrepresented groups in some ways. And so and not to get political, but one of the ways that I was impacted by what's happening in the US is that our NIH grant for coaching and resources for entrepreneurial women, helping women in the biomedical sciences patent their scientific innovations at higher rates, that funding was cut. But we found a way to continue at least this cohort, and that gives us a nice chance to pause and really dig into what we can learn from the data that was collected during the last 3 years of that program. So I think you'll probably see some more from me around that in the coming years. And then one of the areas of growth for me, truthfully, is that part of my responsibility at Duke is to think about team and team development and the role of external and internal coaches in teams. And if I'm being fully honest, that is not my area of strength. And so I'll be doing a lot more research, both in terms of just learning what's already been done and what's out there in the evidence base, and also conducting research in the future on that.
Yeah, it's exciting. I think that is to me, that's one of the opportunities as the field progresses, which is in parallel. I, as you know, was originally a psychologist / psychotherapist, and I did my doctoral thesis on group therapy and studied what makes a group healing opportunity, like what makes healing happen in a group. And ironically, that's what led me to leadership, because all the work that I did around studying groups pointed to the leadership of the group, that it was really what really mattered was creating safety, setting a context, building a sense of vulnerability and openness, whether it's a tea group or Alcoholics Anonymous or whatever the group was. The way it was led was crucial. I had, an interest in leadership even before that, but then it was like, wow, the leader makes a lot of difference in these situations. And so it's exciting to see studies now of how teams evolve, how groups become teams, how teams get led. So it's like the sky's the limit, and then even more futuristic, like when you start working with groups, there may be a real opportunity for artificial intelligence to play a role, because you can integrate tools like AI into a group dynamic, but it doesn't take away from the need for a human to be involved. I don't want to get too far ahead of myself. I'm not sure where that's headed, but I think it's exciting that you are, in a place that's looking at those kinds of dynamics. Like you said, it's still a young profession. There's still a lot of opportunity for us to grow, for the coaches to find things to study.
Yeah, I agree. And I also think, as you saw how important the role of the leader was to the group in creating that type of transformation, the parallel to me also is the role of the coach in providing transformation. And so it is such an honor to be able to work in this field where, what I'm studying is so inspiring. It's like I get to hear stories of human growth and transformation on a regular basis, and it not only does it kind of lift me up personally, I actually think it makes me a better person, because I have these daily reminders of the role of hope and possibility. And so it's really just such a gift. Honestly, it never feels like work. And so I'm really privileged and honored to be able to kind of serve through my work in this way.
That's great. And we've been privileged and honored to have you be part of the evolution of the field with the Institute. I will leave you with one last question, because I think there may be some folks that will listen to this and hopefully be inspired and think about whether they're currently working as coaches or maybe early in their career and, sitting in academia, trying to figure out what do I want to do with my life? I mean, what advice would you give someone who is interested in research, would love to get more involved in the kinds of things you've been describing, but isn't a scientist? Maybe they are coming from a different field. I'm sure you've been asked this question a million times, but what kind of tips would you share?
Well, so I think the first tip would be join an organization like the Institute of Coaching, where you meet other science-minded coaches and where you have access to much of the science. I think another piece of advice would be to read voraciously, but also be discerning about what you're reading. If you're reading peer-reviewed articles in high impact factor journals, you can probably trust that the review process to get there has yielded something that's trustworthy. But one study is not enough. So if you're interested in the science, look for patterns across studies, look for a body of knowledge, not just one study. And if you'd like to get involved in the actual research, I think there are a number of ways to start to do that. One, of course, that not everyone has the ability to do is go get a doctorate and work on this. I mean, there are all kinds of really cool executive doctorates that are aimed at people who want to maintain practice, who don't necessarily want to be scholars. And so this is a phenomenon that didn't exist before. Now there are opportunities to do that. Also partnering with scholars. So if there are researchers whose work you read, reach out to them. If you have a population or a question or a source of funding or something to bring to the table as a partner, there may be possibilities to partner with scholars to get questions answered. Related to the reading voraciously, I would say one of the benefits of being a member of the Institute of Coaching that we often don't talk about is that you have access to a number of journals that get behind the firewall of subscription-based journal memberships. And so you can use the EBSCO databases on the IOC website to do some of that kind of research on your own. But the IOC also curates a great deal of that research for you as a member. So that's also a nice benefit where you can have it in sort of bite-sized pieces rather than the kind of difficult to read, somewhat esoteric language of research. Anything else, Jeff, that you've thought of that are ways that you believe people who are coaching practitioners interested in research can get involved?
I mean, I think you said it beautifully, which is that if you are a coach and you're doing some really interesting work in the world, like working with a team, or maybe you have been asked by your client to incorporate an AI bot into the engagement, and you're like, oh, okay, this will be interesting. It's through the Institute. If you are a member of the Institute, you could easily reach out to any of us, and we could potentially help you partner up with a researcher. And I think there are a lot of really interesting coaching engagements going on around the world right now, could be studied in a more formal way, but they need an academic like yourself who has a really strong understanding of the protocols, the methodologies, and the approaches that need to be put in place to make it rigorous, to make it valid. I think a lot of the opportunity is it goes both ways. Like, we want to get the research that's being done out to the practitioners, but then we have practitioners who are doing some really cool stuff out in the field, and we need to get them to the academics so that they can work together. And any way we can sort of try to bring those two worlds together and make it's for the benefit of everyone, really. And with that, I mean, you already did a wonderful advertisement for the Institute of Coaching, so I won't bother to do another one. But just to thank you for taking the time and for being such an incredible colleague to work with, and a supporter of the research, a provider of incredible valued research. And we look forward to seeing what you do create again in the future. You're hardly finished. I know there's going to be great stuff coming. So thank you for joining us, and we wish you all the best.
Thank you. been wonderful to be with you, Jeff. Really appreciate it.
Thank you, everyone. We'll send you off to podcast land and check out the instituteofcoaching.org, as Angela said, and stay tuned for more of this series. We will have a number of really interesting researchers joining us over the next few weeks. So bye for now. Take care.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Coaching Revealed, brought to you by the Institute of Coaching. You can learn more about the Institute on our website at instituteofcoaching.org. You can stay up to date with new episodes of our podcast by liking and following Coaching Revealed. You can also find us on social media on LinkedIn, Instagram, and X with the handle Institute of Coaching. We also love hearing from our guests, so please reach out to us with thoughts you have on this episode and any questions you have about coaching. Until next time, this is Emily Tarani with Coaching Revealed.